I would like to talk about digital humanism and present a European vision. So presenting a European vision in a sense is a slightly narrowing the topic. I think most of what I'm going to say could be as well an international vision. I just wanted to make the point from a particularly European perspective. This is the basic introduction, and in my forthcoming talk in a fortnight from now, I will be talking a bit more about the underlying philosophy. And maybe I should say that I myself, I'm a computer scientist with a background in artificial intelligence, but also a philosopher and epistemologist. And so I have an interest in both topics. And today is going to be slightly more about, let's say, the computer science side of things. And in a fortnight, I'm going to ask perhaps some of the same questions, but with a different angle, with definitely a more philosophical angle. So, but I'll start with a philosophical note anyway. And the note is that today, one might argue, we live a post-digital life. And this term, the post-digital, has been coined by philosophers and sociologists to express the fact that much of our life actually today is not just digitally supported or digitally decorated, it's actually fundamentally digital also, as well as real, if you like. So we always already live in a digital world as well as in the real world. It is nowadays rather meaningless to try and disentangle the digital and the non-digital world for many areas of life, such as when we work, but obviously also when we teach, when we find our partners, when we exercise. All of this has become digitally mediated, digitally enabled, supported with digital functions. So this is, I think, an important thing to keep in mind, because very often the discourse tends to be about our digital life, whereas one might as well argue nowadays the digital is no longer separable from the non-digital. And if you look in our society about the processes that are digitally enabled, it really ranges from access to information, which again is of course the basis for how we make decisions, be it as simple as a prediction about the weather, or slightly more complex and probably relevant, a prediction about your health or a diagnosis of an illness you have in medicine. It is connecting with people, be it through email, through video conferences or other digital services. It is working with others, which most of the time today now is digitally enabling, using the internet, using networks. It is also in entertainment. It is even in the arts. It's in sports, in health, in short, in all aspects of modern life. But that of course poses the other question, what would living without the digital mean? What does it imply to have no access to digital infrastructure, to computers, to smartphones, to broadband internet connectivity? And whatever it implies concretely, it probably implies exclusion and deficiency. Exclusion from information and a deficiency of not being able to do something, a disempowerment, and it may have very, let's say, light consequences, but it can also have severe consequences if you think about our connections with the financial world, for example, or again, as mentioned before, with digital services in the health area. On the other hand, having digital access means a certain degree of autonomy. It means, for example, getting the right information in time to make the right choices, to make the right decisions, and the power to shape your life in a way that you would like to live it. Yeah? So this digital mediation, this digital way of life is an essential characteristic and also an essential prerequisite for living the way we live today, to making an autonomous living and to being connected to other people. This is quite an important prerequisite, because as we are going to see in the next few, let's say, half an hour or so, not everything about the way that we have been designing this digital world, the digitally enabled world, is probably, well, has followed an excellent choice, so to speak. And let me just also argue that the way of the digital world that it is in, what the characteristics of what we see today in our environment very much have emerged. They have evolved. Edward Lee makes the case in one of the talks that you find in the DICOM Hub, that actually this evolution is far less designed than we may sometimes think, even as engineers. It's not typically following a top-down set of design decisions. Rather, we are reusing code that some other people have developed. We use programming languages that may or may not be perfect for the task at hand. We use design approaches that have been developed perhaps decades ago. So we are layering on top of a history of design decisions that were made a long time ago, and obviously without having in mind the powers of the digital that we see today. So digitization happened jointly with automation over a period of decades, and it was the result of many rather diverse processes of design and of search. Some of these processes were more engineering minded, some other processes were driven simply by businesses, by large corporates, and some processes were driven by government decisions, such as, for example, the creation of the internet. And especially the example of the internet is a case where there was a vision behind these design decisions, a vision of free information, a vision of the citizen participating in global decision-making or even in local decision-making, and the sharing of knowledge between everybody. And this was driving the beginning of this type of, at least the internet type of digitization. But today we have to, I think, assess that our digitally supported life no longer follows such a grand design. It doesn't really follow even a personal design stance. We do not take principled decision about how we would like the information space to be for ourselves. More or less, we are following what is evolving, what has evolved, and what is still very much moving along. And that's the way it is. So we are dealing with design decisions of other people, and there is no longer an all-encompassing vision. No powerful agency is really driving this. There is no general doctrine. There are very few laws, in truth, but there's also no standstill. Things are still developing very much, and you might argue they are actually developing very, very rapidly. Now, in my other talk in a fortnight, I will focus a bit more on whether the digital world, and in particular the internet, is broken. And this is, of course, taking up a quote that was on the title page of Wired in January-February issue 2 years ago, where such prominent authors as Tim Berners-Lee argue that indeed the internet is broken. And what they say in this issue is that, for example, the early ideas of anonymity are challenged today by abusive trolling, by hacks of innocent and vulnerable people, by fake news, by all those phenomena that we see on the internet. They also point out that Whereas on the one hand, we have this big data, the information that we can search for useful rules, for regularities that may help in decision making, in industry, in economics, maybe even in medicine. But the flip side of this is that the internet and other digital technologies have developed into a massive surveillance tool of unprecedented power. The internet has turned into a panopticon of our own making. For those of you who don't know what a panopticon is, it's actually a clever design of a jail where one person, guard in the jail, can monitor a range of rooms where the inhabitants are incarcerated. So this is the panopticon, where the guard person sees everything. And the argument is that the internet has very much become such a tool where some people able to exploit it as a surveillance tool are able to see nearly everything. And then we have the rise of the platforms that we, when they first appeared, embraced as tools for discussion, as tools for knowledge exchange, as tools for getting in touch with people we like, but maybe are on a different continent even. And we now see that the rise of these platforms has created an oligopoly of attention, algorithms that prioritize information and create an emotional response. And indeed, the information, the way it is prioritized and shown to you, is actually designed to create such an emotional response, not necessarily accuracy, not necessarily the right to express, to freely talk about, to express your opinion. So this is an effect that is both economic but also social. It has changed our discourses. It is shaping what we talk about, how we talk about it. And of course, there is also discussion about how to regulate it, what to do about it, let alone the fact that it's economically questionable that the very large networks are so large that they nowadays have billions of users. And someone has argued, indeed, Facebook has access to more people than the Pope has through sermons in all Catholic churches of the world, for example. And finally, the original idea of freely sharing creative output that expands our minds now threatens the creative industry simply by reckless copying, reckless downloading, accessing whatever is on the internet for free, without any consideration of who the original author may be, what his or her rights are, and how he or she might make a living. And these are just 4 aspects, and there are many more, and I'm going to talk about a bit more in this presentation. So what are some of the reasons for concerns? Why is digital humanism perhaps an answer to some of these concerns? And what are these concerns? These concerns include that humans are becoming more and more the subject of machine decision-making. We see more and more algorithms that decide on what should be done, or what should be decided about humans. And simple examples include credit rating, how much are you worth, or face recognition, is this you, or is this someone else? So these are very simple examples, but of course there are much more complex examples. For example, which of your comments in an online social network should actually be published by the network, or should it be deleted? Should it be ranked so that everybody sees it, or should it be downgraded so that no one sees it? And obviously these decisions nowadays are no longer taken by human by and large. They are taken either completely automated by machines, or they are made with the help of machines. We see, and I've briefly mentioned it, a disobjectification of societal discourse. So whereas we with great pride, we created the Age of Enlightenment and its principles of rationally discussing matters in our democratic societies. We basically see a completely opposite emergence of fake news, of echo chambers, where the same opinion is just reflected again and again, or simply false information that is actually influencing people's behavior in ways that can only be called completely unscientific, irrational, and they reach out to large numbers of people at an unprecedented scale, both in terms of how many people can be reached, but also how quickly it goes. And one of the reasons for this may also be that there seems to be a loss of state sovereignty or autonomy, if you like. So states have become less and less powerful in controlling what's going on in, for example, large social media, but generally what's going on in the digital world. And that has many reasons. It's not just the fact that the entities of control may be in other countries. These may be distributed systems that are in principle difficult to control. It has also to do with the fact that politicians usually don't understand technology very well. It is very difficult, and it also would probably require an international agreement on how to regulate phenomena that are networked, such as the internet. One important aspect that I will come back to is that the digital is not just a world of information. As I said before, information is one of the main drivers behind the decisions we make. And these decisions are also decisions we make about our behavior. So once you control information, one might argue, you also control how people behave. And surveying people, understanding or predicting what they do is the first step to also being able to control what they do. And I will give some examples. Yeah, and finally, platforms have a tendency, and we can talk about this maybe in one of the examples also that you perform. They have a tendency to monopolize, to move towards aggregation. It is this phenomenon that has been called the winner takes it all, which has to do with the value of the network connection that increases exponentially in such networks. And this is why large networks make more sense than many small networks. So they tend to bundle market power in only a few aggregates. And then, of course, what you get is one very big, but also very powerful monopoly that becomes, on the other hand, difficult to control. So digitization, without any doubt, has led to improvements in efficiency. It is very convenient. It can even help save resources. It can accelerate revolutions. It can uncover conspiracies, and it can liberate people. But it also has terrifying developments. It can endanger fundamental European values, basic and human rights or democracy. It can strengthen undesirable powers of control, such as the power to find information. It can increasingly alienate us as a human, for example, in the case of labor, and I bring an example in a short while. It introduces brittleness and unsustainability in some cases, for example, when digital services depend on each other. And it can also threaten the economic and geopolitical situation of Europe, but also, of course, of other areas in the world. Digital humanism is let's say, an initiative that develops an alternative to these developments. It tries to develop digital technologies in such a way that it is oriented towards people and societies and their basic values. And I will come back to this by emphasizing that digital humanism also tries to emphasize the choices and the design decisions that we have, that things don't necessarily have to be the way I just described them, but they can be different. It depends on the choices and the decisions that we make, and especially, of course, on the choices and decisions that we make as engineers. So when we talk about digital humanism, especially here at TU Vienna, we have come up with topical clusters, because as you have seen, the problems are broad. They range from online social discourse to brittleness of internet systems. So in order to talk about all these things jointly, we have developed for us these 9 clusters, one being the question of automation and of work or labor, the question of participation in society, then of course the currently extremely maybe overhyped topic of artificial intelligence and an ethical way to deal with it, also the question of human control and identity, indeed the question, what is the human? Of course, implying that if we regard ourselves only as information processing beings, then basically we are nothing more than computers. There is this issue of fake news, echo chambers, communications and democracy again. The question of how to regulate large tech giants. There is the question of privacy, human rights. Also the question of training and education. If I am right when I said that information and the digital is something that puts you in power, that actually supports your autonomy, then we have to also ask, how can we make sure that everybody is educated and develops the right skills in order to be able to benefit from those potentials? The question of digital politics and geopolitics, of sovereignty, of international collaboration as well, and the question of system resilience versus efficiency, and again, participation and democracy in the development of such resilient systems. So these are the 9 clusters, and you will see that we will try and focus in on some of these in the other talks as well. So let me come back to this question of the European values in the digital space. Enlightenment and human rights are some of the most important recent achievements in Europe, historically, basically since the 17th century. They are the foundations for our prosperity, for our justice system, even for our health system, through the insights, through the research, through the science that was done, and all the technical achievements that came with it. European fundamental values should also form, one might argue, the basis for our future. They should be, freedom, democracy, and there should be respect for human rights. But some of those appear to be in danger right now. Democracy apparently is in danger because of the types of societal discourse, because of the way in which people can nowadays monopolize this discourse and not ensuring a, let's say, democratic, systematic harvesting of how people used to talk or used to exchange opinion with each other in the traditional democratic ways that we have established, at least in Europe. There should be respect for private life, something that seems to have completely gone out of the window when you look at many online discussions. On the other hand, we have freedom of expression that is the basis of the democracy, but also of this question of how can we make progress in our societies, if not by exchanging opinions. And this freedom of expression currently seems under threat through algorithmic content moderation, through the fact that nowadays algorithms, artificial intelligence, is designing the online dialogue, the content contributions of users in large networks, but also even in smaller newspaper, online media fora. And then there is the massive question of data protection. Is it still true that we have private communication between two people? To what extent do we think this is necessary, to what extent can we still control it, how can we ensure it. So note that many of these, what I've called human rights or European values and rights, of course, are global. The UN Charter on Human Rights basically repeats these values that I've just described as global values, but it is with pride that we believe Europe had a particularly important role in developing and indeed also codifying these rights. I think I have mentioned this. I can go to the next slide. When talking about the digital, I mentioned that the digital world is empowering, but of course it's not just empowering the individual, it also empowers those in control of the digital technologies. So a part of the problems that we are going to address in this course are about the undivided acquisition of knowledge and exercise of knowledge power. So it's this notion of who knows and who decides what to do with this knowledge. This is a term that has very much been used by Shoshana Zuboff in her book on surveillance capitalism. She makes the case that once someone acquires great knowledge, of course, this also brings great power to influence. And this influence is first, of course, the prediction of behavior, but it is also the creation of control based on previously unobserved or unobservable behavior. What this means is the following. In the old days, we were all just analog humans. We didn't have Fitbits on our wrists. We didn't have smartwatches that measure our data. We didn't type searches in Google. But the more we do that, the more information can be collected about us. The more information can be collected about who we apparently are, how we behave, and how we might actually also behave when presented with a product, a new service, or even controlled in order to move in a certain direction. So this has been termed by Shoshana Zuboff instrumentarianism. It is nothing else but the control of human behavior based on this undivided acquisition of knowledge harvested from information that we provide in our digital interactions with computers or with electronic gadgets. Now, there's one aspect which I think is relatively clear. It is that digital systems may claim human experience as free material for translation into behavioral data. As I just said, once you perform a lot of Google searches, the system may learn about your behavior, and this data can then be used to improve the service, which is fine. So it can make suggestions for what you're actually looking for. It can help search the internet, but it can also be used for fabrication into prediction products to anticipate your preferences and actions. And these prediction products can then be traded in marketplaces to what Shoshana Zuboff calls behavioral futures, meaning that if I know that you like red sweaters, I can sell this knowledge about you to companies who sell red sweaters. And then I can help influence your behavior towards buying these red sweaters. So prediction is, of course, based on a kind of surveillance. It's based on gathering this information, which has become basically the new internet business model. Of course, surveillance also happens in state contexts, but as I said, also in private context. And this splits societies into two groups, into the ones who watch and those being watched. And that, of course, creates asymmetries of power to know and power to influence. Now you might say, but that has always been the case. And it's true. Of course, the state, without anything digital, also had this power. But at the same time, we have developed over centuries instruments and bodies to control that kind of asymmetries, especially in liberal democracies. And the question is, do we still have this power today? But it doesn't stop at prediction. In addition to prediction, digital systems can also exert control. Games can be used as incentives to move people in certain directions. If you play a VR game, for example, Pokemon, it may make you move towards a restaurant that is nearby, if there is a restaurant that pays for this. Or think about maps. Maps are designed to influence your physical behavior. They have been designed to give you information so that you decide or are helped in where to go, which turn to take. And of course, it's relatively easy to suggest routes to you that lead to the nearest shop that pays a certain price for attracting people to its windows. And you might even think about social networks. Could social networks be used to control other types of behavior, and what might the result be? Let me talk about alienation a little bit. So this is a phenomenon that has long been observed. There is this argument that indeed automation has separated us from a tradition of labor that was very human, that automation is at the root of many, not just bodily problems, but also psychological problems when we do repeated manual labor, for example. But of course, we are now facing a new level of automation where not just physical labor is being automated, but also decision-making to a high degree. And the combination of physical labor plus decision-making, which you could call autonomy, is something relatively new. The lawn mowing robot is just one very simple example that has a relatively high degree of autonomy, moves around in its environment, makes its own decisions, and does its job without human intervention. But what does that mean? What does that imply for us as humans? Does it lead, for example, to dequalification? Does it mean that those jobs we can no longer do? And what are we losing when this happens? Is this something that fortunately we don't have to do anymore? Or is it something that actually has a severe impact on the ways we think about ourselves, for example, we understand ourselves? What does it mean when we as humans become the subject of a machine rather than the machine being a subject to my willpower? So what does it mean when I have to serve the machine, but the machine has large degrees of autonomy? And what does it mean if we no longer engage very much with other people at work, but mostly with machines, when we talk to machine assistants, when we, for example, exchange information more with machines than with people? So this alienation of work is, on the one hand, a consequence of automation, which has already been known to introduce changes in work conditions. But added machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, can exacerbate such changes. Where machine operators used to be tasked with monitoring and maintaining a machine, some machines nowadays may increasingly monitor their operators and reduce their power to make decisions. And improved capabilities of machines to work autonomously and make decisions without human intervention can imply a lack of opportunities to learn or to perform the required tasks on the human side. Now, of course, there is something you can do against this. You can train people, you can upskill people, you can add responsibility in theory. The question is, can you also do it within a given organizational framework? And the larger question is, how should we design technical systems such that this alienation doesn't happen, or at least happens in forms where we believe we can make progress rather than just bring new systems to the market. A fourth point that I have mentioned in my slides is a subtle one. It's an introduction of brittleness and unsustainability. And what we have seen in the past decades in the development of IT systems, and I think most of you will have experienced this still, a shift from products to services, a shift from owning a product to renting a service. And then what Shoshana Zuboff calls perhaps a shift from agreement to an uncontract. And I'm going to explain what she means with that. So software, as an example, your word processor used to be owned. It was bought actually as a package, as a physical product. It was delivered. It had to be delivered because internet either didn't exist or there was no broadband capability. So it would have taken days for it to actually be delivered to your computer. But today, many of these things are services that we download, or not even download, we just use them as a service on the internet. We may access it regularly and we may pay monthly fees for our entertainment service, for example. However, by shifting from products to services, what not many people have realized is that there is no longer something we own. We just use something. So we shift from ownership to usage. And although this is IT enabled, you might say, well, it's not really a fault of the IT system. That may be true, but it has severe consequences. So here's a few examples. Just think about your car. In the old days, you had a car, you bought an insurance for it, and you paid maybe a car loan, made payments to pay for the car over an extended period of time. And if you didn't pay, the company would send someone who took the car away from you. But there was a human involved, there were long decision-making periods involved, there were time periods involved. If today you equip your car with a little switch that deactivates the car as soon as you no longer make the payments, your car basically becomes dysfunctional. There is no possibility for you to use the car in an emergency situation, and there is no one to argue with if you don't make your payments. There is a simple switch that turns the car off and makes it no longer functional for you. The same situation happens, for example, with smart metering and energy systems. As soon as you replace your traditional analog meter with a digital system, you may introduce a new power relationship between the energy company and you that simply enables the energy company to flip a digital switch when you no longer pay for the service. And Zuboff makes the case in her book that this is an uncontract. This is no longer an agreement where you thought you buy energy, but it breaks a relation of trust that we usually have in traditional contracts. It is also a case of dehumanization, in which surveillance capitalism disregards the idea that a human being is not just a thing. Personhood is not thinghood. It just isn't the same, even if it may be contractually sound somehow. There is another facet of this, and this is that networked IT systems, so the case where you have many services that collaborate, run in parallel, depend on each other, they have become highly interdependent, meaning that if one of them doesn't work, the whole system doesn't work. Many IT systems now rely on the regular availability of networked services. And this is true for both rather essential services such as banking, security services, but also for, let's say, not so essential services such as entertainment or education. And now this is probably the border of where we are covering digital humanist topics. But of course, again, here the question arises, how do we want to regulate these things? Which rights should we have as humans? How should all of this be verified? How should it be made less brittle? How do you want to identify yourself? But how do you want to identify the machine so that it's not a fake machine, for example? Do we need auditing schemes, and who would perform it, and what are the rules? By and large, many of these things today have no good answers in practice. We are just developing those, but there are very few principles upon which we can build. There are very few principles that would suggest how to deal with these very complex technical decisions. And as a side note, because I think here we are maybe leaving the core topics of digital humanism, there is the question, of course, of sustainability also in an energy sense, in a resource sense. Information technology has become a major consumer of global energy. It can also help to save energy. And in this sense, perhaps we are touching more this aspect of digital humanism as well. But it's an additional aspect that in some cases are really important to think about. For example, when you think about blockchain technology, which is a massive consumer of energy. Final point in my list is this geopolitics aspect. There is this question of, as I said, European autonomy, of European security, of how do we want to ensure prospering European economy. And what I mean here, let me give you one example. Digital systems have become obviously critical infrastructure of national economies. And traditional critical infrastructure has always been the target of power games, of attacks in times of disagreement, in times of war. So the question arises, which degree of autonomy or sovereignty is required for a nation for digital systems? Which governance frameworks are needed to ensure this autonomy? And I've given you a picture here of New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who met with Emmanuel Macron only recently to eliminate online terrorist content. And the question is, why did she meet with the French president? Well, the answer is simply because New Zealand alone has no power to regulate, or at least not enough power to regulate international discourses that may happen in social media. She needs to seek alliances with other nations in order to do that, which creates completely new questions of geopolitical collaboration, but also, of course, of competition. So all of these are areas that touch upon us as humans, that touch upon principles of human rights, of what we think makes us human, maybe. And digital humanism is an effort to react to these developments in a positive and constructive way. So the emergence of digital humanism is very much based on the tension between what's acceptable and what are welcome changes brought about by digital technologies, but then also the indivisibility of European values, of the right of the freedom of speech, for example. Digital humanism recognizes that the digital is inseparable from our way of life, but it strives to develop a vision for a digital future that's worth living in, and to realize this future by making the right design choices and design decisions. At the DigHum Hub web pages of the TU Vienna, you will find the Vienna Manifesto on Digital Humanism. If you haven't read it, please go and have a look. It's a prerequisite for passing this course. And then you find a list of well, they're both challenges, but also, I would say, demands, and mostly political statements. They range from the question of inclusion and democracy of digital technologies, issues of privacy and freedom that I mentioned, but also the question of how to regulate, how to develop rules and laws for the digital world, how to regulate monopolies, and how to collaborate internationally to make sure that we not just regulate, but effectively regulate digital technologies. But it includes also such topic as education, as the right educational curricula that need to be developed. Also the question of academic research. Many of the questions and topics that I have addressed are poorly researched. These are technologies in the making. They are developing quickly, and research is actually challenged to follow these developments and assess them. And this assessment is an important prerequisite before we can do anything about it. So here's my own look at this. It's, of course, first we need to understand what's going on, and this is not so easy. So for example, I give you one simple example. In online networks such as Facebook, as I said, content contributions are nowadays monitored, deleted, ranked with the help of algorithms, with the help of artificial intelligence. But we do not really know how this is done. Most companies do not share the algorithms they use. They do not share the data they use for training. They do not share to what extent there is human intervention. They may give you some numbers, some of them, but by and large, we don't know what's going on. So it's very difficult to understand what's the actual process, how many comments of users are deleted by algorithms, how many comments are generated by AI algorithms. We don't know these things, but that's necessary before we can even hope to understand what the impact of algorithms on online discourses actually is. And then we need to assess those developments. We need to understand, is this good or bad? Which elements do we want to keep? What other elements are really problematic? Maybe we need to react with other types of technology, with other types of regulation. We need to explain those things. We need to explain it not just to our kids, not just to the elderly. We need to explain it also to our policymakers. Policymakers do not very well understand digital technologies in general, let alone some of these very tricky AI algorithms. All they read in media and in newspapers is science fiction, is full of unprecedented, hopes into technology, or the opposite. But it's rarely a realistic account of what's actually going on. So it's our task as engineers, as representatives of digital humanism, to explain these things. And then we need to design systems that are better, that are much more aligned with what these systems should really do, how we want them to be, so that we can actually make progress, and we need to act to make it happen. So this is a broad task. It's a task that involves not just computer scientists. It's a task that involves policymakers, that involves lawmakers. It should also involve businesses. It should involve companies that may perhaps flourish from marketing new privacy-preserving technologies, from providing alternatives to the standard model of online news. It's a question of how to teach, of pedagogy. It's a question also of the arts, who have usually excellent means of also emotionally attracting our attention, of speaking to us not just rationally, but by really puzzling us, by making us feel or understand things at a level that we don't usually deal with in academic discourse. And of course, there are many philosophical questions, because, as I said, sometimes we may even not have the right concepts to express those things. Just think of ownership of data. ownership of data is a very ill-defined term. And we may need some very foundational concepts to better understand what this actually means. So there are deep philosophical questions, let alone the ethical questions. So some of the new directions that research directions that we are going is, as I said, a new understanding. Examples would be philosophical foundations, maybe even anthropological understanding of how humans normally relate to IT systems. There can be new regulation about data, about fundamental concepts, about some basic rights and how they should be represented in online systems. New technologies, obviously, I mentioned privacy preservation, differential privacy as a research area that is hugely interesting because it liberates us from the decision of this all or nothing, either tell the system everything about you or not use its features. But there is maybe a way in between. Engineers are clever people. We can deal with degrees of privacy. New economic models, what should we do if we no longer want to give all our data to those systems? How should they make a living if we still want to keep the services they provide? We need new economic models to address these issues. And as I said, also innovation. We need businesses who then maybe bring these products to the market. So I think most of these topics I already mentioned. In my opinion, Digital Humanism is a positive, productive program that integrates computer science with law, with philosophy and other disciplines. It currently very much clarifies some basic questions because this is early stage. We have just begun. We have just realized how complex these matters are. But we already now know that we need new technology, we need new foundations. We also need international collaboration because many of the problems that I have mentioned are not just Austrian problems or European problems. Most of them are global problems. And we need to understand how we can actually bring them to society through technology, through policy, and also in businesses. If these are topics that you find interesting, let me just tell you there are other actors in Vienna who deal with similar problems. There is, of course, the University of Vienna participating in this course with its faculties of philosophy, political science, of law, but also sociology, psychology, pedagogy, all play a role. If you like, even theology. They finally found an interesting topic to discuss, the human mind and its relation to the absolute, which might be AI. There is an Austrian Research Institute on AI. There is Secure Business Austria. There is the Virtual Reality and Visualization Competence Center. There is an art university, actually several ones, who participate in this, in at least parts of this question of digital humanism. And then there are also non-governmental associations such as None of Your Business, Epicenter Works, or the Arge Daten, who deal with questions that relate to digital humanism occasionally. In short, if your impression now was this is a broad and complex field, then unfortunately I have to say yes, it is. It is also a very interesting, very dynamic field, and sometimes you feel overwhelmed by the range of questions. But on the other hand, I think it's also a very rewarding field because it enables us to maybe take a step back and look at what we really want to achieve, what we really want to do. And if you're interested in this, please have a look at some of those references that I mentioned. I think perhaps a must read is Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism. Unfortunately, it's a very thick book. Zuboff also wrote a much shorter article for the New York Times, which I would highly recommend. Or you read one of those reviews of her book if you don't want to read the whole thing, which I think has over 600 pages. Yeah, and that's, I guess, at this point, everything I wanted to say, and I'm sure there is plenty of questions